Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creep Smith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Tonight's tale, The Crow House Story, by JoshuaAndrew1985. I thought nothing could scare me, and then I went to the Crow House. I was doing another stint in jail when I first heard about the house. My cellmate told me all about how he wanted to break into it as soon as he got out. That might sound a little weird, but Tommy said he had his reasons, and I didn't care enough to pry. In hindsight, I should have cared a lot more. At Lights Out, Tommy told me so many strange stories about Old Man Crowther and the house that he'd built by hand. I only half listened, as I was focused more on getting to sleep. I used to make Tommy so mad by getting a good night's sleep. He'd say something like, "Man, that story about the moving shadows didn't scare you?" No, it did not. None of them did. Mainly because I knew they were just stories kids told other kids. Nothing like that was going to be as scary as my first purse snatch or the drug deal I negotiated with the triads, or the dozen other times that I'd faced the barrel of a gun. But that fearless attitude tripped me up bad after I got myself out of jail. Tommy showed up one day with another dude who was roughly twice my size, yet Tommy introduced me as the man with no fear. So, of course, I couldn't back down from what I thought was a heist of the Crow House. Tommy wasn't leaving anything to chance. He sent me to City Hall. I was going to get the blueprints Crowther had to have submitted when he got the permit to build all those years ago. I zoned out while I drove. I must have, because I remember driving, and then I was there. The receptionist told me that the permits and building department was just 2 rights and a left, down a hallway that she pointed out. 2 rights and a left. I repeated it like a mantra, and I found the office I needed. Soon enough, I had the blueprints in hand. I looked them over briefly, but I couldn't make heads or tails of it. The Crow House was built like a maze. I wasn't worried. I knew how to get around the maze. You just touch a right-hand wall and keep contact with that, and you'll eventually make it out. It's boring and inefficient, but it'll work out in the end. Story of my life. So I left repeating a new mantra. A right and then 2 lefts. A right and then 2 lefts. But after that second left, I found myself turning to a bookcase-covered dead end. Confused, I went back and then to what I had thought was the first left. After a while, I found myself back at the door to the permits and building department. I opened it for help, but now a new hallway greeted me. It ended with a T intersection, but there was some red graffiti painted on the marble wall. It said, in my own handwriting, "Don't go left. It just loops around." Then suddenly I jolted awake. I was laying on the ground in front of a T intersection with that same red graffiti. Memories flooded my mind as I remembered getting back from City Hall, planning with Tommy, driving up to this cursed house, and entering it. And that was a day ago. Look, I'm sorry for the theatrics, but I needed you to understand what this house does to people. It's not just a confusing layout. It actively tries to mess with you. I thought it was some gas leak disorienting us at first, but the things that I've seen and felt and killed, they couldn't all be figments of my imagination. For a while, we stayed focused and even quickly found Crowther in the living room, looking like he'd been dead for several months, just rotting in a chair in front of his television. We prodded his skeletal remains, and their presence actually emboldened us to take our time exploring the nearby rooms. There wasn't much left worth stealing. We knew that coming in, to only expect the money that Tommy was giving us. Regardless of what we found, he'd already paid us $300 each, and he'd pay us another $500 after the job. Apparently, 4 girls had gone missing when Tommy had lived on this block. He was obsessed with proving that Crowther was behind the disappearances. Obviously, I regret taking it, but it seemed like easy money at the time. We ended up leaving the blueprints in the living room because they seemed to be mistaken at every turn. The house just seemed absolutely normal. So, we didn't mind splitting up. I know, dumb move. But the sun was shining bright, and we were 3 dudes convinced that we were the scariest thing in that house. Tommy took this dude, calls himself Thor, and they headed down to the basement, since that's where he was most likely to find the remains of a murder-sex dungeon. I went straight to the upstairs and quickly searched the bedrooms, but found nothing. The upstairs hallway was dark. The attic stairs came down easily enough, but I found no windows up there, which made the darkness stifling. It seemed to swallow the dim beam that came out of my flashlight. Because the light couldn't reach the walls, I felt like I was wandering around in some kind of infinite void. To tell the truth, I kind of liked the feeling. It was otherworldly, and I felt my imagination was inspired for the first time in a long time. But this must have given whatever influenced us an opening. I turned around, expecting to see a softly glowing square showing how I could get down. Instead, I saw nothing but darkness. I panicked for the first time right then, running towards where I thought the door would be, and instead, my body fell through the floor with a tremendous crash. My fall was broken by a bed on the floor below, which wasn't as lucky as it sounds, since my ankles painfully smacked the wooden floorboard. I laid there, expecting the house to come alive with angry yells about what a moron I was. Instead, it remained silent everywhere. After I confirmed that neither ankle was broken, I left the room and found myself in the upstairs hallway, still with the attic stairs pulled down. But now, the hallway seemed twice as long and accommodated twice the rooms. I went straight for the stairs again, but walking down them just led to another hallway full of rooms. I wandered around and opened doors, but only found more hallways behind them. Turning around showed a similar sight of more rooms where the stairs had been. At first, I thought my fall had messed me up in the head rather than the ankles. But no matter how far I walked or how much I rested, nothing got better. I didn't understand it. I didn't need to. I just went into survival mode and forced myself to stay calm. I touched the right-hand wall of the next hallway I entered and walked as fast as my sore ankles would handle. I ignored the flickering lights. I didn't turn to see what was going on with the shadows in the corners of my eyes. I wasn't going to be distracted from my goal of getting out of this place. I called out for help at regular intervals, but I never heard from either of my crew. Instead, I found myself looping back around and out to the first hallway. See, that's the problem with the right-hand trick. It doesn't work if you start out with a disjointed wall. That's when I started tagging the environment with the spray paint that I carried. We had intended on spray painting murderer over the front door as we left, but all of those plans were dead to me now. I thought I made some progress, but this was a large maze, so I ended up eating the few snacks that I'd carried and taking a nap. That nap led to the crazy realistic dream I had. Now, since the graffiti warned against going left, I went right. A right and two lefts. I'd found myself repeating the mantra from my dream. With nothing left to lose, I followed it, and the second left led to a new room. The kitchen. I ran over to the fridge and opened it wide. Yeah, that, wasn't my brightest move. To be fair, I was starving. I was not thinking of how everything in there would be spoiled if the owner had been dead for half a year. Worse, there was way more meat there than there should have been. Just plate after plate filled with rotting meat. I recoiled from the sight and the smell of it all. But that's when I saw them. Two large pit bulls that had just walked into the kitchen and were already starting to bare their teeth at the sight of me. I still wasn't scared. These were flesh and blood enemies. These were things I could hurt. I thought I'd take that any day over head games. I pulled my revolver out, but the sudden motion caused them to charge. In my haste to react, I fired wide, and then I had both of them on top of me. I fell to the ground and sacrificed my right arm, using it to shield my face while I pressed the revolver against the nearest one's ribcage and fired again and again. I saw the pantry door open and Tommy peeked out. I screamed at him to help, but he actually asked, "Me? Are you talking to me?" Even with one of my arms being torn to shreds, I could have strangled him. I put the revolver against the head of the dog that was ripping and tearing the flesh and muscle from me. The pain was unimaginable. I fired once, and the bullet entered just behind the eye and exited out the other, grazing my elbow. But the dog didn't stop eating me. I fired again and again. Half of its skull was gone, but the jaws seemed to work just fine regardless. The next time I pulled the trigger, my gun just impotently clicked. I started pistol whipping the dog when Tommy called out, still from the pantry, "Are you done yet?" Furious, I yelled back at him, "It won't die! Help me!" Tommy opened the door and walked right up to me, bent down, and asked, "What won't die?" I stared at him, then looked back to the dog, and it wasn't there. The other dog was no longer weighing me down either. I stood up and examined my mostly uninjured arm. The bullet graze was now the only damage. I started to explain to Tommy, but he shook his head and said, "It's the house, man. It's been nothing but insanity since Thor and I entered the basement." Then Tommy started to tell me where Thor was. Well, what was left of him. But I stopped him. I told him that didn't matter right now. We just needed to focus on getting out of here. He tried to tell me, no, you don't understand. We found the girls, man. We found them." And as dispassionately as I could, I told him, "No, don't tell me what happened, because it's only what you think happened. When we get out of here, Thor could be alive, and it could turn out that those girls were never here. Whatever you hear or see or smell, it doesn't matter. I thought those dogs were real, and I wasted all of my rounds. We're going to get through this by being smart and being careful from here on." I didn't tell Tommy that I was only half sure that he himself was real. It wouldn't have helped anything. Either way, I was just happy to have someone else around. We were just as lost, but the company helped. The kitchen door opened to a library with a long, mirrored wall to one side. I ignored it and instructed Tommy to do the same, even though when we'd come in, I thought I saw our reflections doing everything we did, but with the wrong hand. I was steadfast in my desire to not let the house fool me again. I knew the tropes. I'd seen hundreds of horror movies. Maybe this was just gas. Maybe it was ghosts, but I'd figured that whatever was going on, we could only be hurt by ourselves or each other. which meant that if I just kept my head down and stepped carefully, we would make it out eventually. And then we reached the dark room. Seemingly randomly. We just opened a closet door and found that eerie black void again. Somehow, I found this comforting, since it was one of the first oddities that I noticed about the house. Maybe it would be one of the last. But we had to get through it either way. Tommy and I, such tough, strong ex-cons that we were, started to hold hands. It was dark enough that I could never see all of Tommy at one time, and I swept my flashlight over him several times in that dark room just to make sure that it was his hand that I was holding. Then, my light briefly illuminated movement behind Tommy. I didn't explain, I just pulled him along faster, but while I looked behind, something caught Tommy's eye from the front, and he yelled at me to look out. I snapped my head forward and saw that our light was finally reaching a wall. We'd found the end of the attic. I was fully prepared to knock down a wall and drop 2 or 3 stories to the ground to get out of here, but Tommy pointed up. My light followed the direction of his finger, but it struggled with the darkness in the air. Still, I could make out that there was something hiding in the corner of the attic, the upper corner where the walls met the ceiling, and it was something big. It started to walk down the wall. The details were hard to make out, but I counted 8 legs, and that's all I needed to know. I pulled the crowbar out of my bag and started attacking the wall with all my might. I slid the metal in between the wooden planks and pulled them out slowly. Tommy tried to warn me that the spider was coming closer. I looked up, and I could see that it had appeared to grow more. Smaller legs, but it was only a little closer. Shaking my head, I just told Tommy to quit worrying and help me get out of here. He asked me, "Man, does anything scare you?" I just grunted in reply, but really had felt like the house had thrown me a softball. I've never had a problem with spiders. I get not liking something small crawling all over you, but making it a giant spider removed any of the fears that I might have had. And then the next strike against the wall produced a thick stream of sunlight. I tore into it greedily right as the thing above fell down right next to Tommy. I turned around to tell him not to worry, that the spider wasn't real, but then all of the words left me. Standing behind us were the 4 girls. They were all pretty, wearing white nightgowns and seeming to have their heads fused together at the scalp. They were permanently in a crab position with their backs toward the floor and only their feet touching the ground. Their arms flopped around as they moved in sync towards Tommy. All 4 girls were sobbing. I didn't wait to see what else they would do. I was terrified. I launched myself at that small hole and squeezed myself out of that house like I was the last bit of toothpaste from a tube. After I popped out, a spray of blood followed. Quarts of the stuff. I tumbled on the roof, and my vision was disoriented from the rapidly changing direction of my head, the blood in my eyes, and the bright light that seemed to blind me even when my eyes were closed. It didn't matter. I couldn't have stopped myself if I tried. I fell from the roof to the eaves to another lower roof, and then again until I felt like I was falling down a flight of stairs. Until I hit the bottom and realized that I had been falling down a flight of stairs. And I was still inside the house. My despair was short-lived, since I also realized that I was next to the living room. I crossed to it to get to the front door. I only slowed to pause before Mr. Crowther's corpse. I didn't know what he had done or how much of this insanity was because of the house or him or whatever, but I still wished that I had bullets in my gun because I would loved to have drilled him in between the eyes. That's when his gray, paper-thin eyelids opened and he stared at me with completely white eyes. That scared me pretty good too. I grabbed the nearest thing to me and I ended up breaking his left forearm and shoving the arm bones into his left eye. I pushed in hard, trying to hit brain. Instead, there was a squeal of pain that sounded like it came from within the head, and green blood, for lack of a better word, squirted out behind the ocular fluid. Whether or not that meant that he was truly going to die, I left him writhing in that chair. I needed to get out. It was almost welcoming to burst open the front door and see a sea of red and blue lights. I found out later that my gunfire had resulted in the neighbors calling 911. I didn't mind. I needed the company. Even as they threw me to the ground and handcuffed me, I was happy. At least until I got paranoid about all this just being another hallucination of the house's design. Now, well, there's a lot that scares me. Spiders and things that look like spiders scare me. Going to sleep, waking up, they both scare me. Stairs scare me. But I get to stay locked up, where it's nice and mostly safe, for a long time. They have no idea how I twisted Thor into the pretzel they found, and they never found Tommy's body, so the death penalty's out. Still, it didn't look too good to have all of Tommy's blood covering me. They keep me in solitary, because I kept splitting my cellmates' heads open to check for little men that might have green blood, just in case. But at least my insanity defense looks to be strong. I'm hoping that I can get transferred to a more comfortable hospital soon. In the meantime, I just have to be on the lookout for any logical inconsistencies. The house is not going to trap me again so easily. If I'm still in there, I'm gonna need to find out as soon as possible in order to escape. No, wait, it's not helpful to think like that. I have to remember that I'm safe. Of course I'm out. It's been weeks since I was in that house. I think it's been that long anyway. It's just really hard to keep track of time all alone in here. Sorry, I'm not thinking clearly. I can just check the calendar on this laptop. On the laptop. How did I get a laptop in solitary confinement? Wait. Where am I? Where am I? Where am I? Since my last post here, I actually cleaned up my act a lot. My memory's still fuzzy on how I got a hold of a contraband laptop, but the guards took it away as soon as I made all that fuss. Anyway, I got a great public defender who was able to save me from the murder charges and even the B&E of the old Crow House. He truthfully argued that we were in there because of a reasonable suspicion of foul play, and we rightfully searched the place for survivors after finding Mr. Crowther dead in the living room. It helped that none of the prosecutor's experts could agree as to how exactly Thor had died, and they'd never found Tommy's body. I was still convicted of the assaults after I'd been imprisoned, but I took a plea deal and got just 5 years probation, the majority of which I would spend at Oregon State Hospital. Of course, nice as my lawyer was, I never fully trusted him. I had made a sort of peace with the thought that I might still have been trapped in the Crow House. Its illusions and specters looked, felt, even smelled real. I can still remember the pain of feeling a dog ripping the flesh off my arm. So it took a good year before I could relax. you can only be paranoid for so long. Then you get just tired of all the fear. I decided that if it was a hallucination, I would just wait and see where it all went. And truthfully, I figured that if the house could create illusions this good, I was a dead man no matter what I did. Either way, I managed to make life work at the hospital for long enough. Eventually, my memories of the house faded so I could start to sleep naturally again. I made lots of progress with my therapist about issues that had plagued me before the Crow House, and I eventually got a clean bill of health from the hospital. I got a job as a librarian, of all things. I'm heavily tatted, but none of them are on my neck or face, so I got to work in a long-sleeve sweater with white gloves. I've always considered myself an intelligent brute, but after a haircut and a shave, I actually started to look like I belonged here. I didn't completely let the Crow House slip from my mind, though. I used my position to study up on that location and found some pretty interesting stuff. Police reports and newspaper articles revealed that the land the Crow House had been built on had been terrorizing people long before Mr. Crowther owned it. Probably the most interesting example was an incident with the people who owned the land before Mr. Crowther. Only the husband made it out of a house fire that he freely admitted to setting himself. He had a wild tale about moving across the country for his job, only to find his new office was a maze of cubicles that he couldn't get out of. According to him, half of his new co-workers were out to kill him, and the others seemed just as scared and lost as he was. He said he must have wandered those gray walls for days without ever finding an exit. Instead, he finally managed to find a lighter and set the nearest cubicle ablaze. Of course, he was only trying to get firefighters to come to the rescue, but it was only when the fire had spread too far to stop that he suddenly realized he was standing outside his own home. The rest of his family had been asleep, and they were unable to be helped. 3 days after his arrest, he hung himself in jail, just like I almost did. The fire cleared the way for Mr. Crowther to buy the land and build that monstrosity of a house that I'd been trapped in. While they didn't have as much trouble as I did, it still took the police weeks before they eventually cleared the house of the 4 bodies. Oh yeah, that's another reason why I managed to get off so light. Besides Thor and Mr. Crowther's body, they also came across the bodies of a couple in the basement. They had both died of heart attacks and were found sitting in a corner, holding each other tight. The couple had died long before Mr. Crowther, and it helped paint him in a bad light, even though there wasn't enough evidence to definitively say what had happened to him, or to them. All this news made me feel simultaneously more and less sane. I clearly wasn't the problem going into the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was forever corrupted by it, even if I really had escaped. Now, you might be wondering why, if I suspected I was still in the house, I would trust anything I was reading. Well, I'd never read anything like this before. I figured that when I was speaking to someone, if I was still in the house, then it was like I was speaking to the house. Same with reading. That information had to come from somewhere. I mean, true, it could have been the house messing with me, but I thought it was more likely that it would brag about itself. All of this got pushed to the side when I met Sandy. Every day she would bring her kid in for my library's storytime hour. I finally got the nerve to just talk to her. Not only did I think she was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen, but I was worried that she was the trap that the house was building to. I was lonely enough, though, that I just went for it. Illusion or not, she was beautiful. And it turned out very single. We started dating, and suddenly the world got a lot brighter. It felt more real, too. I got to know her son, Mason, and he actually seemed to like me. So, you know where this is all going. First, life got great. Then Sandy and I got married. I won Oregon's Librarian of the Year. I found out Sandy was pregnant with a girl. My life was now perfect. Too perfect. I'd never forgotten about the Crow House. Couldn't. It was always there in the back of my mind. When I got angry at Sandy and maybe took it a bit too far, she always forgave me. Too easily. Mason was too good a kid. My work was too easy for too much money. I tried to ignore the feeling in the pit of my stomach, and it was easy at first. I guess I really didn't want Sandy to be fictional. But then, a new book, at least new to me, was returned to the library. A history of a tribe that had split from the Modoc Native Americans that used to live around here. I started reading it to figure out which shelf it needed to be returned to. Just after the first page were two maps of the area where this tribe used to live. One was what the land looked like at the time they occupied the area. The other was the same image, but with a current map overlaid on top of it. The second map clearly showed the Crow House right next to the tribe's main camp. After seeing that, whether or not I was still in the house, I felt like this book was a message for me. So I kept reading. The tribe called themselves the Deniga-McClocks, which roughly translated to sun-setting people. They were sort of a cult that had been ostracized from the larger tribes for their beliefs. Basically, they thought the world was going to end soon. However, their leader had once come upon a cave with a long, twisting passage, and this man had had an epiphany on how to save the world, at least temporarily. He immediately started making sacrifices of the young women in his tribe. And when the world didn't end, his efforts were declared a huge success. He didn't just kill the girls, though. They were drugged and then carried deep into the cave with plenty of food and water. When a girl awoke, she would be free to try and find her own way back out. However, the author of the book theorized that the whole maze had been rigged, maybe with a stone covering the entrance. Nowhere could they find any evidence that anyone had ever survived this exceedingly slow execution. Plus, the tribe wouldn't have wanted a survivor. The whole point was for the young woman to have hope, but to ultimately fail. For her to consistently pray for the gods' guidance, and for those prayers to get increasingly more and more heartfelt and desperate as time went on. Basically, they were trying to wring every last drop of devotion out of their sacrifices. And it worked, or at least it appeared to. They figured the gods wouldn't want to destroy a world as long as it could still produce praise this pure. Either way, using the death maze got so popular that they eventually had to kidnap young women from other tribes, then use people of all ages and all genders to keep a steady flow of wretched prayers coming. This led to a war with the larger tribes, and the Deniga-McClocks were eventually wiped out. Their conquerors feared the cave still, though. They thought that it was haunted with hundreds of lost souls that were still trying to find their way out. So they filled in the entrance and stayed far away from it. At this point, it came as no surprise that the location of the cave was exactly under the present location of the Crow House. The book did have one last shock for me, though. Immediately after finishing it, I looked at the author to see if I could maybe find and speak to them later. The book had been written by William Crowther. There was no author photo, but it couldn't have been a coincidence. I practically threw the damn thing away from me. The house was taunting me. Somehow it had delivered the book to me. The easiest explanation was simply that I was still in the house. I tried to reject that idea once more. I left work immediately and drove home. Sandy was on the phone with my confused boss when I got there, but she was already telling him that I wasn't feeling well. I just went to our bedroom and flopped on the bed to try and think things through. Soon, Sandy joined me and asked what had happened. I'd never talked to her about my stay in the mental hospital or what had happened in the Crow House. She had known about all my other stints in prison, but that's it. So I finally told her. When that ended, Sandy looked scared, but she told me that she believed that I believed it had happened. My boss had told her that it was clear I was having some trouble at work today, so I should go ahead and just take tomorrow off too so we could have a 3-day weekend. Sandy started to say how we could use that time to relax together, get better, but I cut her off. I told her something along the lines of, "Don't you see how wrong this is? Bosses don't give you time off if you leave work. They fire you." We argued for a bit more, but I felt silly arguing with the house because that's who I had to really be talking to. The house was pretending to be my wife. I told her that I was on to her. She had trapped me before, but she wasn't going to trick me anymore. The thing that called herself Sandy burst into tears. She told me that I was scaring her. She begged me to think of our unborn child, of Mason. I almost tore into her head then and there to see if there's anything alien about her biology, but then the house had Mason burst into our room while I was wrestling Sandy to the ground. In the end, I couldn't go through with it. Real or not, I couldn't hurt her. I didn't want to see Sandy hurt. After getting up and all of us calming down, I promised that I would get better. She gave me an ultimatum. Our child would be born in about a month, so she would stay with her mother during that time, and I had to use every resource that I had to get better by then, or else I wouldn't be allowed to be a part of this family anymore, or even to see the baby. At the time I thought, like it's actually mine. I just went along with her plan to get some peace and quiet. I tried to think of a way that I could escape, for real this time. And that's when I finally decided I would visit my father. We have a complicated relationship. The house wouldn't be able to accurately portray Dad given how repressed my own memories of him were. I showed up at his apartment with no warning, knocked. He opened the door angrily, but just stood there in shock for a moment, and then he started crying. He sobbed while telling me how sorry he was and how many regrets he had. This wasn't my father. My father couldn't go 5 minutes without hitting me. This was the house, just trying to show me what I wanted. Again, I pushed him. He balled up his hand in a fist for a second. I thought I saw the man who raised me again. Yet this imposter just dropped his fist and tried to pull me in for a hug. He kept apologizing, asking my forgiveness. He tried to tell me that he'd changed a lot over the last 20 years, probably because the house knew it wasn't fooling me. It had to come up with some excuse, and I almost believed it. Almost. Instead, I knocked the old man to the ground and pulled a hammer from my waistband. I cracked open his head and I searched and searched for anything alien living inside. When I didn't find any, I wasn't sure how this worked. The only thing I was sure of was that bloody mess on the floor, that wasn't Dad. Not that it mattered to the police. After all, they were just the house too. So was the judge. That's why he was still so lenient. He put me back in the hospital again, this time for life. This house is really good at mind games. It's not revealing the charade until it thinks I've let my guard down again. For whatever reason, it has decided to let me have a laptop. Again, in universe, they told me that communicating with others would help me face my delusions. And once again, I have to play along. But only until Mike, the orderly, stops paying attention. Recounting everything that's happened has just been to keep my hands realistically moving over the keyboard. I know there's no one really out there. It's taking forever, but Mike can just keep watching me type merrily along. Eventually, he'll take a break, and that's when I can finally escape this house. Don't need long, just 5 minutes or so. Probably less than that, since I already used my spare sheets to make the noose last night. See, I'm escaping for real this time. So even if you think it's fake, remember what George Herbert said. Living well is the best revenge. The only thing I have to add to that is, even if you do think it's fake, checking out early only gives them what they want. Stay scary, wildlings, and make the most of your nights.